Is Dean Williamson, and I'm a local pastor, and I'm so thankful that I got the opportunity to come and talk to you all today about the plausibility of the resurrection. So let's get right to it. I've been asked to address the claim that the resurrection may be one possible explanation for what happened after Jesus died, but it's not the most plausible explanation for what happened after Jesus died. And so I'm very encouraged that you all are open to the possibility of the resurrection hypothesis. But what you've asked me to look at and discuss with you today is the plausibility of the resurrection, and that must be one of your concerns. And so as we're looking at different possibilities for what happened after Jesus died, we need to keep a couple categories in mind. In a criminal case in our justice system, you have to prove something beyond reasonable doubt. And when we're examining this historical data, we are not able to come to such a conclusive verdict that we're able to prove beyond any possible doubt that Jesus Christ did rise from the dead, or that he did not rise from the dead. But instead, we're dealing with something more like a civil case, where we're examining what is the preponderance of the evidence lead us to believe. So instead of being at 100%, we're at maybe 51%. And that's what we're looking at today, is plausibility. What is most plausible? And I think the best way to do that is to look at the possibilities and examine the plausibility of each one. So let's start with one possibility. Here's a possibility that's brought up by scholar Bart Ehrman, is that the early Christians misremembered what happened after Jesus' death. So what he's saying here is it's not so much specifically about the resurrection as it is it more plausible that a man was raised from the dead, or that somehow along the line the stories got changed? And here is some of the evidence that is brought forward by Dr. Ehrman. One is the telephone game theory. You might have played that here. And if I was to whisper something to Miles, and Miles was to whisper something to Nathan, by the time it got around here, it might have changed because there's so many points at which the message could have been corrupted. But I don't think that the telephone game theory is the best way to describe what happened in the Gospels. And let me explain why. First of all, it presupposes a couple things that I don't believe are true. First of all, it presupposes that the Gospels were anonymous books that were written by non-eyewitnesses well after the events that they describe. And secondly, there was a long period of uncontrolled oral transmission. And so we could represent this as, here's one person telling another person, telling another person, telling another person, telling another person, who then writes the Gospels. But the reason I believe that this is a bad analogy is because there are no anonymous copies of the Gospels. So you would expect that if the Gospels were originally anonymous, that we would have a physical copy that's untitled. But every copy, a manuscript that we have of the New Testament that survives intact enough to have a title, has a title, and it's the same title, it is ascribed to the same people that our titles today in your copy of the New Testament are ascribed to. Also, there was no early church disagreement over who wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So you would expect if one church decided, I'm going to add names to the Gospels, the church was spread out in the early centuries of church history. And you would expect maybe there might be some disagreement. I think this was written by this person. I think this was written by this person. But we don't have that in our church history. And also, they were most likely written within living memory of the events that they describe. Even Bart Ehrman believes that the Gospel of Mark was written either in the 60s or the 70s, and that Jesus died probably around the year 30. So we're talking there were people who saw the events that are described in the Gospels that were still alive at the time that Mark was written. Also, the earliest traditions stemming from the apostles affirm the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And we have one of those in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul, at an early date, in a book that's undisputed by critical scholars to have been written by the Apostle Paul, who, in another undisputed book, the book of Galatians, was shown to have, or claimed to have, spent time with the 12 apostles in Jerusalem. He says, I pass down what I've received, and that is that Jesus died, that he was buried, that he rose again, according to the scriptures. And so, also, another thing I want us to think about in terms of misremembering the events is how far we are removed from the first century and also the first century Jewish culture. We don't live in so much of an oral culture, oral tradition. And I was thinking back myself to, I actually have a small example that I'd like to share with you of oral tradition in America. And this is only for a certain subset of Americans. These are the people who hunt or fish. And I know you probably heard the fishing stories of, the fish keeps getting bigger. But I'm talking about hunting stories. You have to be a little bit more accurate when you're talking about hunting. And so Bart Ehrman questions whether oral tradition can accurately preserve a story. I'm not an anthropologist, not a sociologist, but from my own experience, I can tell you a story that a hunting story of my scoutmaster. He said that one day he was hunting with his son, and they were sitting back to back, and he saw in the bushes the tines of a huge deer, and he without seeing the entire deer, he just shot. Now, when he walked up to this deer, he found that it was a moose. And it is illegal in the state of Massachusetts to kill a moose. So what did my scoutmaster do? He literally just ran. And never went back to that spot until months later. And then he went and he looked at the carcass of the moose, and someone had written an insulting message to whoever killed the moose on the carcass of the moose. I was able to recall all of that. Now, I heard this story when I was a teenager, so maybe 13 years ago, I heard this story. This story was told to me by my scoutmaster, and he said something about statute of limitations about 7 years, so there's at least 7 years. So we've got 20 to, I'm estimating this story has been preserved for 20 to 30 years, just in oral form, never been written down. So I believe even from my own experience, that the early traditions can be passed down accurately. Now, I might not know. I don't remember what insulting thing was written on the skull of that moose, but I remember the main details of what happened in that story. So what we really have here in the telephone game doesn't work, because what if this person who saw the events was interviewed by the writers of the Gospels? We don't have all these opportunities for the story to get corrupted if we have the eyewitnesses alive and contributing to the Gospels. So I really don't think that that's the most plausible explanation, and I hope you're seeing that as well. Possibility number 2 is that when the early Christians saw the risen Jesus, they were hallucinating. And I want to take this seriously, because there really is some evidence here. And the evidence is that grief-stricken people have been known to experience apparitions of their dead loved ones. And being in a grief experience and having lost a loved one does put you in a more likely scenario for you to experience a vision or an apparition of seeing that loved one come back to life. Now, let me explain. While I see the evidence here, I don't believe that this evidence points to hallucination in the case of the disciples' experiences of Jesus. Because we have to look at the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, was he grief-stricken? when he experienced the risen Jesus Christ? No. He was on his way to persecute Christians. Was he expecting the resurrection? No. By the fact that he was persecuting Christians, it shows that he believed that the resurrection never happened. And so this really casts doubt on the hallucination theory when it comes to what happened after Jesus died. And Michael Licona, in his great book on the resurrection, which I highly recommend to you, says, since hallucinations are mental events with no external referent, one cannot share in the hallucination of another. In this sense, hallucinations are similar to dreams. And what we also have in that passage I referenced in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is that Jesus, the risen Jesus, appeared to the 12 disciples and also to a group of 500 people at the same time. So if we're to take seriously what psychology tells us, and psychology is telling us that two people have never had a documented case of having the exact same hallucination, we can't apply that to what the disciples saw in the gospel. So as a final note I'd like to leave with you, psychoanalysis is very difficult to perform when the patient is lying on the couch in the psychologist's office. So why do we think that we can do it on people 2,000 years after the fact? That's why I believe that that possibility doesn't seem plausible to me. The possibility 3 is that early Christians invented the story of Jesus' resurrection. If the story wasn't changed, and if it wasn't a result of hallucination, something that they saw that wasn't real, then maybe they just made this up. Let's think about this one. And when we think about this one, a lot of people who might think that they lied, they might point to the motivations behind why they did it. You have to have a motive, right, in order to prove, let's say, a murder. We might conjecture that the early Christians wanted Jesus' teachings to live on, even though he had tragically died, or invented the story of the resurrection to rescue his legacy or to assume power positions in the new movement. You know, they were really looked up to in this new Christian movement. Maybe they did it to get power. You know, people are always after money, power. But the only thing is, if you're in let's go back to our court case illustration. If you're in a court case, just because you have a motive doesn't mean that that person did the crime. And so just because we can attach some kind of motivation, the possible motivation, this was never expressed by the disciples, doesn't mean that they necessarily lied. And let's think about the story that they made up. Why would they have told it this way? I don't believe that they would have told it this way if it was made up, because the disciples look really bad. They deserted Jesus at his hour of need. And they wouldn't even believe the story when it was first told to them. I think because of the embarrassment factor, this is not a story that would be made up. Also, talking about court testimony, thankfully today, women's testimony holds up in court. But back in that day, women's testimony didn't hold up in court. So why would you invent a story like that? Do I still have one more minute, or is that it?
Yeah,
okay. And while people frequently, actually, relatively frequently, might die for a lie, people don't regularly die for something that they made up and know is false. Would you die for a lie, or would you be willing to recant if it came down to it? And then finally, we have the empty tomb itself. If this was an invented story that Jesus rose from the dead, the Jews would have been able to quell this Christian movement from the very beginning by producing the body of Jesus. They were unable to do so. I think this is evidence that points to possibility number 4, that Jesus was raised from the dead, and that the early Christians truthfully testified to what they had seen and heard. And this makes sense of the historical bedrock. This is why I am a Christian, why my faith is, I believe, rests on good and solid evidence. The historical bedrock that Michael Licona brings forth is that Jesus died of crucifixion, that his 12 disciples and other eyewitnesses had experiences that led them to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, and also that the Apostle Paul, whom we talked about earlier, had an experience in his conversion experience, believed he saw the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, those three facts are agreed by the majority of scholars, both on the critical side of things and on the conservative side of things. And I believe that the resurrection hypothesis makes sense of those very important historical bedrock. And also, one final illustration I'd like to leave with you is what is impossible with men is possible with God. Mike Lacona uses a story. He shares a story about his 12-year-old son. If you were told to tell him that his 12-year-old son could lift 200 pounds above his head, he would say, "No, that's impossible. That I couldn't see that happening." But if you were then able to say there was a bodybuilder behind him helping him lift those 200 pounds, then you might say that's more plausible, that's more believable. And so I'm not saying that Jesus Christ rose from the dead by natural consequences. That doesn't happen. But what I'm saying is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead by supernatural power of God. And so what N.T. Wright says is that the resurrection is a necessary condition for the rise of Christianity. And so what I want to leave you all with is that if these three options for believing what happened after Jesus died are not true, what is your explanation for the rise of Christianity? How Christianity went from one man and 12 disciples to a major movement that today expresses so much influence on our world.